Hello, good evening and welcome to Biz1st In Focus. Our topic of discussion today is going to center around Indo-Lanka relations, the past, the present and the future. To talk about this long spoken about, extensively discussed topic and maybe to give us some new perspective on it, we're joined on Biz1st In Focus this evening by Dr. Singharaja Thammitha Delgoda. He is a historian, an art historian, an international relations expert, and also an expert on the law of the ocean. Dr. Delgoda, thank you very much for joining us on Biz1st In Focus. Let's talk first about post-war relations between India and Sri Lanka from 2009 onwards. May the 18th, Sri Lanka wins the war with the LTTE, and we see shortly afterwards, not shortly afterwards, a few years after that, a change of government in India, a sort of change in direction for India, more bullish, business friendly with the election of the government of Narendra Modi. How do you view Sri Lanka's relations post-war and post-Modi election?
There seems to have been a complete shift. I'll start off with Modi. Now, when Modi came to power and he won the election, for his inauguration, he invited all the heads of the neighboring South Asian countries, and this signaled a very clear expression of intent. Part of the realization was that India could not be a great power until it is reasonably stable in its own backyard. And Modi's first visit was actually to the mountain kingdom of Bhutan, which is vital part of India's Himalayan border. So Modi himself has signaled a very clear expression of interest. This region matters, and before we can go on to dreaming of becoming a world power, we must first establish ourselves totally and securely in our own region.
It's an interesting thing, his trip to Bhutan, that he would pick a country with a border dispute with China.
Well, India has never forgotten its defeat at the hands of China in 1962. They have beaten Pakistan 3 times, and Indians are very bullish and confident that they can do it again. Yet, in 1962, the Indian army withdrew as far back, even Calcutta was left exposed. It was a complete disaster. And it is something India has never forgotten. So its attitude to the Himalayan border is a totally different ballgame today. In the 1960s, it didn't take it seriously. India is very, very conscious of its vulnerability to China. Hence, the first visit to Bhutan.
Let's come back to the post-war relations with Sri Lanka that India has had with Sri Lanka. Immediately after the war, we've seen a number of projects that have been undertaken by India in Sri Lanka, specifically in the areas of housing, in the estates, in the hill country, and also in the north and east. There have been numerous housing projects that have been undertaken. I think India has built about 40,000 homes so far, if I'm not mistaken, and there are many more projects in the pipeline as well. The immediate post-war situation with India, what's your take on that?
Well, it appears to be a complete circle. In 2009, the prevailing opinion was that Sri Lanka would never actually win. And all of a sudden, India had to revise its opinion. Yet from 2009, you have a sustained period of attrition and opposition. You have India breaking with precedents and voting against Sri Lanka in Geneva at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and adopting a country-specific resolution. But all the other South Asian countries voted for Sri Lanka. India was the only one to vote against. 2012, you have Sri Lankan pilgrims being attacked. 2013, you have Buddhist priests being attacked in South India. You have officers being asked to leave their training. You have the High Commission attacked. All of a sudden, Narendra Modi comes in 2014. There's a much firmer stamp on foreign policy, much stronger control. Now, Modi is a product of the RSS, which is a Hindu
nationalist organization.
It's a nationalist and culturally conscious organization, and he has actually much more freedom, appears to have much more freedom than the Congress administration had. All of a sudden, his relationship with Sri Lanka, of course, it's helped by the fact that there's a change of administration. Now, an Indian Prime Minister has never come to Sri Lanka in 25 years on a direct visit. In the last 2 years, you've had 2 official visits by the Indian Prime Minister. It may be actually a very good opportunity to actually enforce and buttress India's position with a weak Sri Lankan government, and this is a very good opportunity. So the wheel has shifted in both ways. You have a strong Sri Lankan government and a relatively ineffective Congress administration. You have a very strong, decisive BJP government backed by the RSS, working in a totally different political environment in Sri Lanka. So now is a very good time for India, because it may not happen again.
Is it a cause for concern for Sri Lankans?
Sri Lanka has to do something it has never really thought of. It must think apolitically on the lines of the national interest. National security, the definition of national security is that you control your own destiny and you have control of your own decisions. This, I think, is something Sri Lanka has yet to face up, because we keep swinging from party to party and policy to policy. India does not. India sees Sri Lanka. There are several phrases. One is the conceptual one, backyard. Backyard means you can go and play in your backyard at any time. Little brother. If I call you my little brother, that means, I expect you to do what I say, otherwise, Also, Shiv Shankar Menon described Sri Lanka as an aircraft carrier anchored off India. Right throughout Indian strategy and politics, there's this consciousness that Sri Lanka is the vital underbelly of India. So, if you're thinking strategically, you will use diplomacy, politics, strategy, any other means you can, to make sure that your underbelly is totally secure. And the current visit and the previous visit, Prime Minister Modi goes to Anuradhapura. He reaches out to the country's majority population. Next day he goes to Jaffna and he tells the people of the north, we are your guarantor. We will look after you. Now, in 2017 he makes his second visit. No Indian Prime Minister for 25 years. All of a sudden, 2 visits in 2 years. He makes his second visit, and whilst speaking about Vesak, whilst worshipping at the Ganga Rame, and also going to the Maligawa, the next day he reaches out to a totally different community, the community in the hill country, which has for a long time has seen itself as Sri Lankan Tamil. The interesting thing is, Modi is claiming them as part of the Indian diaspora. This community has never seen itself as Indian Tamils. It has always described itself as Sri Lankan Tamils. All of a sudden you have Modi doing the same thing that he was doing in Jaffna. When you build houses for someone, sorry.
Dr. Delgado, I'm just going to stop you right there. That's an interesting subject where you talk about the plantation sector, the estates and the community living there, and the links to India. We'll come back to that right after this short commercial break. Stay with us. You're watching Biz1st In Focus. Welcome back to the program. We're in conversation with Dr. Singharaja Thammitha Delgoda. He's an expert on international relations, also a historian and an art historian. We're talking about Indo-Lanka relations. When we left off, we were focusing on India's relations with Sri Lanka's estate community in the hill country. Dr. Delgoda, there was a lot of talk about India's relationship with this current government, with President Maithripala Sirisena and with Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, and with the former President, Madam Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga, and India's deepening relationship with Sri Lanka following the 8th of January 2015. But this year, this Vesak, during his Vesak visit to Sri Lanka, Prime Minister Narendra Modi did meet with former President Mahinda Rajapaksa and did extend an invitation to him to visit India as well. There seems to be, even immediately after Narendra Modi was elected, there seems to be a mutual respect between these two leaders, Mahinda Rajapaksa and Narendra Modi. Where do you see the Rajapaksa element in Narendra Modi's plans for South Asia?
Preferably not there. If Narendra Modi had a plan for Sri Lanka, I'm sure that they would prefer the Rajapaksas not there.
Why invite him to come visit the country?
Well, he didn't do that when he came in 2015.
He's done it this time.
He's done it this time. Why do you think that is? After massive political turnout, which nobody thought at the May Day rally. It's one clear signal, but even before, over the last year, there have been all kinds of indicators. Now, maybe, also one thing you must remember is that Mahinda Rajapaksa was there when Modi was inaugurated as Prime Minister of India. All of a sudden, maybe India is also looking to the future. Otherwise, the invitation which is tendered this time was not tendered 2 years ago. What is interesting is it appears that the meeting was asked for. I'm not sure who asked for it.
Well, it was reported that the former president had sought an audience with the visiting Indian Prime Minister, and it was ironic because at the same time you have the joint opposition, or elements of the joint opposition, protesting against Narendra Modi's visit.
It's a very ambivalent signal. At the same time, if you're playing politics and you're looking to the future, you don't want to line up everybody in the neighborhood against you, especially the biggest player in the neighborhood. And the joint opposition or demonstrations, they were actually quite muted. I think the Indians and Prime Minister Modi's immediate group were expecting a much greater level of opposition. So this may have been something of a placatory gesture. Look, we're not really as threatening to India's interest as you think. Maybe.
Dr. Degoda, we saw that in the MOU that was signed between Sri Lanka and India on several development projects surrounding the Trincomalee harbour, the oil tanks, the liquefied natural gas plants, power stations, the terminals, etc. A lot of these projects are not bilateral, they're multilateral. There's an involvement of Japan as well. At the same time, you've got Sri Lanka pushing for rule-based freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean. Is it a stand that would please India, this rule-based navigation of the Indian Ocean?
It's certainly in Sri Lanka's interest. In a multilateral environment where there are many players, no one regional power can predominate. I'm not sure that I can't comment on whether it would please India or not, but certainly it's in Sri Lanka's best interest to have many players, and if you want to be a hub, Indian Ocean hub, a hub is for everybody. When you have a lot of people involved, no one player can say, this is my backyard.
India is in quite a precarious situation when you look at its neighbors. All of its neighbors are developing very close relations with China, be it Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, the majority of the BIMSTEC countries, or all of the BIMSTEC countries. So for India, do you get the feeling that India feels threatened right now with the One Belt, One Road initiative set to take off, with the China-Pakistan economic corridor coming in across disputed territory between Pakistan and India? Do you feel that India is being geographically and metaphorically as well cornered?
What is clear is that Indians feel that. Indian diplomats, Indian politicians, Indian intellectuals, if you watch Indian TV, by very eminent commentators, there's always this constant fear of encirclement, and the fear is that Sri Lanka is now part of it. The point about the One Belt, One Road is that it cuts across Pakistan-occupied Kashmir to reach from Kashgar to Gwadar. Now, until now, the issue between India and Pakistan is a bilateral issue. The moment you have the One Belt, One Road reaching right across Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, it becomes a multilateral issue. It's no longer bilateral. The attention of the world is focused there. So actually this raises huge problems for Indian security, and that's fairly clear as to why India boycotted the One Belt, One Road conference. Once it becomes multilateral, it becomes an international issue. India has tried to keep it out of international politics. And also India cannot deploy the sheer financial resources that the world's #2 economic superpower can.
And it's a very cash-rich superpower as well.
It's very cash-rich. It's also founded on trade and export, which is why ports such as Hambantota, Colombo Port, ports in East Africa, Bagamoyo in Tanzania.
We'll come back to the One Belt, One Road initiative and India's position on it, because I also want to talk to you about some of the concerns that have been raised regarding China as well. All this and more coming back right after this short commercial break. Welcome back to the program. We're talking about Indo-Lanka relations, and we're going to move to Indo-Lanka relations in the context of China, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and bilateral issues in South Asia taking on a multilateral angle. Dr. Devgada, thank you very much for being on Biz1st in Focus. We've reached the final segment of this program, and you were talking about how the issue in Kashmir now has gone from a bilateral issue between Pakistan and India through the construction of the China-Pakistan economic corridor through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir to a multilateral issue. Even in Sri Lanka, we're seeing engagement now with India is coming with Japan as well. Sri Lanka has its own border problems with India in the north, in the maritime border, with the Kachativo Island. Not necessarily with India as a whole, but with the Tamil Nadu state government. Do you see through this One Belt, One Road initiative, even that maritime border issue taking on a multilateral angle?
Well, I think it's in Sri Lanka's interest to multilateralize its sovereignty. One of the most interesting things about Indo-Sri Lankan relations is that with this administration and the previous administration, you have complete disrespect for Sri Lanka's maritime sovereignty. You have something like 40,000 incursions of 2,500 Indian trawlers on Mondays, Wednesdays and Saturdays, fishing Sri Lanka's natural resources. And Sri Lanka seems to be powerless, whether it's Rajapaksa or whether it's Sirisena and Wickramasinghe, powerless and unable and unwilling to do anything about it. The most interesting thing is that the Indian perception is that they have a natural right to fish in Sri Lankan waters, and I think Prime Minister Modi was asked, well, why is the Sri Lankan Navy detaining our fishermen? You should take this up. It's not about sovereignty. It's not about natural resources. It's the fact that this is our natural right to fish here. So this is one issue which actually completely reflects the need for multilateral engagement, because the environment, as you know, is a multilateral issue. It concerns all humanity. Once we destroy the seabed, we destroy our animal proteins, we destroy our employment, we destroy our exports. And this is actually one of the few ways that Sri Lanka can actually protect itself when it is relatively powerless.
There was a salient point that India raised, that the Indian government raised over this One Belt, One Road initiative, and taking on and developing countries taking on such massive development projects and ending up with an unbearable debt burden. In Sri Lanka already we are seeing serious debt concerns, serious debt issues stemming from the Hambantota port, the Hambantota airport, Chinese funded project. Isn't that a valid cause for concern that has been raised by the Indian government?
Well, it's interesting that India is so worried about it. Actually, it should be the Chinese who should be even more worried about it, because if Sri Lanka can't pay its debts, and that's replicated tenfold right around the One Belt, One Road, that means it's the Chinese economy which gets hammered. Nicaragua is the poster boy of Chinese debt. What is curious is the Indian government is worried about our debt. I can imagine how frightened the Chinese must be that half these nations are not going to be able to pay for their infrastructure. It's a very big brother thing, isn't it? Oh, you know, you may not be able to pay back your loans, back to what we said earlier. You know, I'm here to advise you. That may cost you a little bit more than you can pay. It's very unusual language, almost didactic language for diplomatic parlance, isn't it?
So you don't think it's concerning?
I'm sure it's genuine concern, because, of course, if we can't pay back the Chinese loans, we're going to have to give them more and more stakes, which are not going to be in India's interest. And I'm sure there's genuine concern on that part. The reaction to the fact that the Colombo port city was blocked for a year and a half, almost a year. This is a huge investment. This is actually a Forbes 500 company. Yet it was blocked. Was that blocked out of concern for Sri Lanka? It could revolutionize Sri Lanka's future, make it the financial capital of South Asia. But Sri Lanka had to pay a massive amount to actually reinstitute the costs which were incurred by the Chinese company. Why was it blocked? From where did that pressure come? Does that reflect?
There was a lot of pressure raised domestically against that by environmental groups.
Yes, but there was very, very clear pressure, which was political, which was administered, and that was administered for strategic reasons, not out of concern for Sri Lanka's finances. The environmental thing is totally different.
In Sri Lanka's engagement with China, leave aside the concerns being raised by India, you can't dispute the fact that we are accumulating a rather large debt burden towards the Chinese. The Chinese are not going to write off this debt. even the conversation on debt to equity swaps, again, you're putting yourself at the mercy of the Chinese government. In Sri Lanka's engagement with this One Belt, One Road initiative, do you think that our policymakers, that our leaders, need to be paying more attention to China's motivations and China's ambitions, and whether we can afford to become debt-strapped so that China can achieve its motivations?
I can't help but agree with you wholeheartedly. Hambantota was not offered to us, we asked for it. Colombo Port City was offered to us. So I agree with you entirely. We have never, on either side of the political divide, considered the implications, strategic and economic relations, of the nature of our economic undertakings with the Dragon and the Tiger. We're just looking at building roads, keeping people happy, making everyone feel good. We're not looking at the future. So I agree with you.
And what should we be looking for in the future?
We should be looking at Sri Lanka's strategic interest. Every country has its own national interest. Economic. It's not in our economic interest to be debt-strapped, to be so debt-strapped that we can't say no. And let's look at China's behavior. In the Indian Ocean, it's totally different because it's off its own territory. The South China Sea, China's behavior is totally different. So these are things.
But once China has more investments in this region, don't you think that their behavior might become quite similar to what it is now in the South China Sea region?
Quite possibly, and this is the kind of implication that we should be considering. And certainly debt for equity. The original understanding for Hambantota was something like 500 acres in the immediate region of the harbour, which is normally what you need. Rotterdam, all the great ports have a large hinterland. If you parcel off 1,500 acres of your land, you're going to create huge repercussions for the future, because it's your land, it's not land which is created like Colombo Port City. So
Dr. Devgoda, unfortunately we're running out of time, but I think the important takeaway from this has been that when it comes to foreign relations, especially with two massive powers like China and India, it's very important to ensure that you multilateralize in every dealing you have with them.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for being on the program, Dr. Devgoda. Thank you also to our viewers. We'll see you again on Biz1st In Focus next week.